Good day, viewers all over the world. My name is Nyashe Zashe Bigondo, and I am an Africa University student, and I'm studying international relations. And so today on my presentation, I'm going to be presenting on the Agenda 2063 in creating the Africa we want. Right, so the major objective that I'll be looking at in this presentation, right, is the deliberation on the vision of creating a United States of Africa. Right, we'll be looking at its origins, the history and progression even up to now, its advantage to the African continent and hindrances amongst other factors. So firstly, before we get into the whole thing of the Agenda 2063, we may first understand what is the United States of Africa, right? So the United States of Africa, right, is an ideology that has been propounded by African fathers, the likes of Kwame Nkrumah, the likes of Robert Mugabe, and the other people that have been the founding fathers of the African soil. So their main objective, it was to unite Africa immediately in terms of political and economic integration, right, to form a United States of Africa, which consists of the African Common Market, right, where we are talking about the recently signed Intercontinental Free Trade Area that was signed in 2020, if I'm not mistaken, and it was signed by around 37 member states of the African continent, and some are yet to rectify it. And also we are talking about the likes of the African Monetary Union, where we are advocating for one currency as Africa, right? Like what is happening in the European Union, where they have the same currency, right? And it makes it easier for them to trade amongst the member states of the European Union. So also we want to formulate the model that is directly linked, or that is directly proportional to whatever has been happening there, right? And also we want to create a continental wide union government where we have a one president, right, who would lead the African continent. Then we will have state governors as countries, right, and also one passport and sector, because it doesn't make sense that I am in the African continent, but you take a look that if I want to go to Nigeria, I must have a visa for me to go to an African continent. It really doesn't make sense. There have to be free movement of people, free movement of goods, whereby I may be able to move from one country to another without any extreme restrictions that are needed when I'm going abroad. So yeah, this is what the scope of my presentation will be focusing on, right? So in terms of Agenda 2063, in creating the Africa we want, right? So Agenda 2063 is Africa's blueprint and a master plan for transforming Africa into a global powerhouse of the future. It is the continent's strategic framework that aims to deliver on its goal for the inclusive and sustainable development, and is a concrete manifestation of a pan-African drive for unity, right? So we'll be advocating for unity, for self-determination. We'll be talking about freedom, progression, and collective prosperity pursued under Pan-Africanism, right? So when we're looking at that genesis of the Agenda 2063, it was a realization of African leaders that there was a need to refocus and reprioritize Africa's agenda from the struggle against apartheid and the attainment of political independence for the continent, right, which had been been the focus of the organization of the African Union. So the African Union, right, its main priority, right, is to create an inclusive social, economic development and continental and regional integration, democratic governance, peace, security, amongst other issues aimed at repositioning Africa to become a dominant player in the international arena, right? So moving on, we get to know that as an affirmation to their commitment to support Africa's new path for the attainment of inclusive and sustainable economic growth and development, right? Africa heads of states and government signed the 5th anniversary Somme Declaration during the Golden Jubilee celebration of the formation of the OIU, or the African Union, in May 2013. So right, the declaration marked the rededication of Africa towards the attainment of the Pan-African vision of an integrated, number one, prosperous, peaceful Africa driven by its own citizens, representing a dynamic force in the international arena. So, and the Agenda 2063 is the concrete manifestation of how the continent intends to achieve this vision within the 50-year period from 2013 to 2063, right? So furthermore, we can look that the need to envision a long-term, a 50-year development trajectory for Africa is important, as Africa needs to revise and adapt its development agenda due to the ongoing structural transformations, right, which have increased peace, reduction in the number of conflicts, renewed economic growth and social progression, the need for people to be centered on development. We are talking on issues of gender equality, youth empowerment, changing global contexts such as increased globalization and the ICT revolution. We also will be talking about the increased unity of Africa, which makes it a global power to be reckoned with and capable of rallying support around its common agenda and emerging development and investment opportunities in areas such as agribusiness. We're talking about infrastructural development, health, education, as well as the value additional in the African commodities. Right. So before we get into the salient components of the Agenda 2063, right, we have to look at the history of why there was a need for us to call the African continent to come together as one again, right? So when we look at our history, right, we understand that Africa was once one, and all the civilization of the African continent, it actually originated from the Kemet, which is Egypt, right? That's where everything emanated from, and Africa was one. And Africa, it can't be divided because we are from one ancestry. So what we have to look at here, we have to look deep and go back to our root cause in order to solve the problems that has affected Africa, right? So we see that all these things, it started with the foreign invasion of the colonialists when they came to divide us as a continent. This it emanated during the Scramble of Africa and the Berlin Conference, where the big powers, the big European powers, right, they divided the African continent as a piece of cake, right, and they shared the slice of the portion of Africa to various big powers within the international arena, right? So you tend to take a look that during the late 19th and the early 20th century, right, the majority of the African land was controlled by white European empires, with the British controlling around 30% of the African population, and at its peak resulting from the Berlin Conference, right, of the 1884 and the Scramble of Africa, right? So all this, it divided Africa in terms of language. There was now language barrier in terms of Africa, because we were colonized by different colonial powers that spoke different languages. We have the likes of the Anglophone, the likes of the Francophone, and the Spanish, and also many other colonial masters that colonized the African continent. So moving on, we have the founding fathers that were the pioneer of this movement, and one of these pioneers was Marcus Garvey. So the term United States of Africa was first mentioned by Marcus Garvey in his poem Hail, United States of Africa, in 1924. So Garvey's ideas and formation systems, it deeply influenced former African leaders and the rebirth of the African Union. So when we look at the ideologies of Marcus Garvey, right, the central theme of Marcus Garvey's political thought to Africa, it was characterized on patriotism, nationalism, consciousness to Africans in Africa and in the diaspora, right? So we tend to look at Marcus Garvey was also the founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was formed in 1914 to promote the improvement of living conditions for Africans and African people of African descent living in the North and the South American, the Caribbean, and the European, right? So meanwhile, when Garvey called all Black Americans, right, he called all Black Americans to be proud of their race, and he preached their return to Africa as their ancestral homeland. In the same vein, right, Marcus Garvey contributed immensely to the growth of the Black nationalist movement in the United States and beyond. And through such a forum, he called for African unity and redemption among working class blacks. In this regard, he promoted black pride, political and economic emancipation for blacks everywhere, and the repatriation of blacks to Africa. He established a movement known as Back to Africa. This was one of the founding fathers who started the ideology of the United States of Africa. Then when we fast forward to 1960 to 1963, where there was the establishment of the OAU, the Organization of the African Unity, where we see the main ideologies that were the founding fathers, like the Kwame Nkrumah, who advocated and chaired Pan-Africanism movement in Africa, which he outlined that Africa must unite, right? Africa must unite immediately, politically, economically, right? And there should be an integration in order to form a state that we want, right? Consisting of what I talked earlier when we are talking about the African Common Market, the African Monetary Union, the African Military High Command, and the continent-wide union government. It was such an ascension, right, that paved a way for the establishment of the Organization of Africa Unity in the 25th of May 1963 at Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And Kwame Nkrumah was amongst the pro-founder of the organization, right? We see that despite these fathers being the pioneer of such an ideology, right? This idea has been disputed by many African leaders because of their selfish ambitions. Just because most people, they are mostly interested on themselves rather than the majority of the Africans at large, right? We see that Mohammed Gaddafi was also one of the founding fathers that came up with this ideology in 2009 when he was elected as the chairman of the African Union in Ethiopia, right? Where he was first appointed, right, as the chairperson, he gave a speech that I shall continue to insist that our sovereign countries must work together to achieve the United States of Africa, right? And he was really criticized by the global North and the Western because they felt like Gaddafi wanted to seclude them from the African continent. And this is backed up by the BBC report that Gaddafi had proposed a single African military force, a single currency, and a single passport for all Africans to move freely around the African continent. Other African leaders stated that they would study the proposal's implications and rediscuss it in the long run, right? The focus for developing the United States of Africa so far has been on building subdivisions of Africa. The proposed East Africa Federation can be seen as an example of this, right? There have been a lot of people that have been in support of this ideology besides Gaddafi or the president of Libya. We see also the likes of Robert Mugabe, and recently we have Julius Malema, the leader of the EFF, Economic Freedom Fighters in South Africa. He's the one that has revitalized the spirit of one Africa, and he's trying to decolonize the African mind such that they may not focus on, let me say, focus on being dependent on the West, but they should create the one Africa that they desire, right? Because we see that there have been a lot of hindrances when it comes to the realization of this dream, ranging from corruption, political governance, conflicts, the system of democracy in Africa, and the likes. And one of the key elements that I have seen, right, I can give an example of what is happening in South Africa, right? In as long, right, as Africans are divided and they are not united, the realization of this dream is inevitable. Why? Because the more we are divided, the West knows that there's nothing that we can do. So yeah.